I'd like to begin my questions by focusing a bit on the crimes charged in this case. I know you said you're only partly familiar, but among the crimes charged were murders, executions, exterminations and purges of enemies at places like S-21, the Tuolslang prison, and other security centers throughout the country, purges of the East Zone soldiers, and purges of various groups like former Lon Nol soldiers. Mr. Nunchea, in a book that has been quoted a few months ago by his counsel, and that's E3/4202, the ERN is 0075752. He's quoted it. The book says Nunchea doesn't apologize for S-21, even though his niece and others close to him were sent there. Professor, in your research, did you ever come across anything to indicate that the DK authorities put any of these people that they imprisoned or executed on trial before any court of law?
Just as I have been interrupted all the time, Mr. President, I would like to have the ERN numbers, please.
Yes, counsel, I gave the ERN number.
When they were mentioned. But just read out.
I just read it out, but I'd be happy to give it to you again. It's 00757-521. So, sir, I'm just reminding you.
I was asking for the Khmer and the French ERNs.
Okay. We'll get those for you. Sir, the question, and again, please wait for the microphone light, is did you come across any evidence in your research that the Khmer Rouge put any of these individuals that were detained or executed on trial in any court?
In my research, I did not come upon any evidence that people who were executed were put on trial in any court.
Professor, in your research, particularly in the Soviet archives and research of what the Soviets had of Vietnamese documents, did you find any evidence that among the thousands detained at places like S-21 and Krang Tachan, that these people were any evidence to support the DK's allegations that these people were in fact Vietnamese spies or traitors?
No, I did not come upon any evidence to show that any of the people executed were Vietnamese spies or traitors. Although I must point out that I was not specifically researching on that subject.
Thank you. And that's true of many of the questions you were asked this morning. Mm-hmm. You weren't specifically researching on all of these topics. Is that correct?
Well, the general topic I was researching on, but I was not familiar with all of the material.
Thank you. So I'd now like to read to you another speech by Nunchea. This is at E3/196. In English, the ERN is 00762-402. In Khmer, it's 0022-4473 and the next page. And in French, 002806. Begins at the bottom of 0674. This is a speech of Nunchea dated the 30th of July, 1978. And I'd like to get your reaction to the reasonableness of his statements. In the speech, he indicates, "It is more widely known that the USA planned to seize power from us 6 months after liberation. The plan involved joint action on the part of the USA, the KGB, and Vietnam. And he goes on to say, at the end of that paragraph, we know the current plan involves not only Vietnamese agents, but has something to do with U.S. imperialism and KGB, all of them. Can you react to the reasonableness of Nguyen Chea's statement in this speech?
That strikes me as a very bizarre and paranoid explanation of what was happening. The idea that the United States would be cooperating with the Soviet Union and its intelligence services, the KGB, at a time of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union seems to me absurd. But I might point out that this kind of construction of conspiracies is not peculiar to democratic Kampuchea. It's been a feature of most totalitarian states like the Soviet Union, like China, of mixing together people of completely disparate intentions, ideologies, and purposes as part of a fantastic conspiracy.
So I'd like you to comment. I don't think you didn't go into any depth in your answer about one particular aspect of the statement, and that is U.S. cooperation with Vietnam. During the decay period, so from April 1975 until January 1979, can you explain to the court what was the state of the United States' relations with Vietnam?
Mr. President, I object to this question and also the previous question. Prosecution is misleading the expert in relation to that speech. It is very well known that the words CIA and KGB are code words for agents working on the one hand for the Soviet Union in Vietnam and on the other hand agents working for the CIA. They don't mean CIA or KGB itself. Plus, I must say, this is not a speech that was written down by the CPK. It is a translation by the Danish Communist Party visitor and subsequently from his handwritten notes translated into Danish and English. So to say that these are literal quotes from Nguyen Chia is incorrect.
Your Honor, Mr. Kopet should not be testifying. We certainly, if he wants to testify, would love to cross-examine him. His claims that these things are well known, that KGB doesn't mean KGB and CIA doesn't mean CIA, we think is absolutely unsupported by the evidence. But what he's done, what I'm doing right now is I'm wasting the time to examine the expert because I'm responding to something that's not related to my question. Sir, I think you remember the question. So, Professor, if you could wait for the microphone light and please give us your answer.
President, the objection by counsel Victor Kope is overruled. The question by the co-prosecutor is irrelevant. Therefore, the expert, please give your answer.
Yes. During this time period that you're referring to, Vietnamese-American relations were extremely cold. There was one attempt to break the ice by the Carter administration, I believe, in 1978. But apart from that, which amounted to very little, there was no cooperation. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, it was in 1979 that there was an espionage activity undertaken by somebody who was an agent of Vietnam against the United States. There was no closeness of relationship between the Vietnamese government and the United States government. On the contrary, it was an extremely unfriendly relationship.
Was the issue of Vietnamese cooperation with Americans missing in action an issue during this period of time?
Yes, it was.
was there also a dispute about Vietnamese claims that the Nixon administration had promised them a massive amount of aid at the conclusion of the peace treaty that was not delivered?
Yes, it's true. There was a dispute, a major dispute between the two countries, the United States and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, over the delivery of aid, which was not delivered. That was a matter of contention between the two countries.
You were asked this morning about DK relations with Thailand, and I would just like to bring to your attention another document in this case, and that is E3/8177. Actually, I'll skip that because I only have the English ERN, and I think Council wants us to have the Khmer and French ERN, so I'll ask that to be looked up. And I'll come back to that perhaps later. So one of the points you write on page 98 of your book, in English, the ERN is 01001765, and on to the next page, is the following. You said that according to the Deputy Military Commander of Vietnam's Tay Ninh Province, during April and May 1977, the Khmer Rouge forces had carried out systematic attacks upon Vietnamese border villages, making it impossible for Vietnamese peasants to work there. The Vietnamese side claimed that it then offered to settle the border question peacefully with the Khmer Rouge, but the offer was refused. According to the Khmer Rouge, according to the Vietnamese, the Khmer Rouges then concentrated up to 2 divisions on the border adjacent to Tay Ninh. And in the middle of May, these forces undertook massive attacks upon Vietnamese territory. Do you recall writing this?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell us what you know about what was the reason the Khmer Rouge carried out the attack, if you know of any reason?
I don't know of any reason why they carried out the attack, other than one can speculate on what the motives were, but I don't know of any objective situation of conflict emanating from the Vietnamese side which might have led to that attack.
Were there, you've been quoted reports, your own writing, the writing of Nyan Chanda, there are other academics about these attacks by Khmer Rouge forces into Vietnam. Are there similar reports about Vietnamese attacks before April 1977, not speaking about the islands, into Cambodia?
No, I'm not aware of any such reports.
Sir, are you familiar, changing topic a bit, with an organization known as FULRO?
Yes.
Do you know if the FULRO received support from the Khmer Rouge?
Yes, I think they may have, but I'm...
Okay. Let me read to you from the book by Nyan Chanda. The ERN in English is 00192-282, and in French it's 00236-990. There's not a Khmer translation. Chanda wrote, "The successes achieved by his men in destroying Vietnamese villages and massacring civilians in surprise raids since April 1977, and the lack of Vietnamese response might well have boosted Pol Pot's confidence. The fact that Hanoi faced a severe food crisis, deep social malaise in the south, and armed resistance from different groups, at least one of which, the United Front for the Struggle of Oppressed Races, FULRO, received material support from the Khmer Rouge, might have also emboldened the Khmer Rouge to challenge Vietnam." Would you comment on Chanda's analysis about whether Vietnam's own internal problems could have influenced Pol Pot to believe, and the DK leadership, that they could be successful in attacking Vietnam?
I think that belief that there was some kind of internal problems in Vietnam may have influenced Pol Pot. However, I suspect that he was behaving in a rather paranoid way in response to what he thought were enemies within inside the party, and attributing any potential opposition, actual, real or imagined, to Vietnam, and therefore trying to show a reaction to what he perceived to be threats.
Mr. President, short observation. Also, on behalf of my national colleague, Chanda has been translated into Khmer completely. There's a full Khmer translation of Chanda, so I would appreciate if we also get the Khmer here in.
Mr. Koppe, you are aware that we have given you a lot of leniency when it came to references. Now, I have no objection to what you are saying, but please expect to be held to the same standard in the future.
Thank you. My apologies, and I have been handed some of these ERNs. First, for the first quote I gave about Nun Chia, not apologizing for S21, the French is 00849. Is that 4 or 9? 415. For Chanda, the quote I just gave, the Khmer ERN is 001914415. That's the same ERN, so I'm going to have to double check that. We'll double check that. Sir, I'd now like to ask you about these attacks in April and May. From the information of your research, from what you learned from Chanda and other sources, did these Khmer Rouge attacks into Vietnam concentrate only on military targets, or were civilians targeted?
President, Mr. Expert, please hold on. The floor is given to Council Victor Cousset.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know that we have an expert who's giving testimony, and a priori we can speak of many things. On the other hand, the topic that the co-prosecutor intends to raise, if he's talking about the incursions of the Army of Democratic Kampuchea into Vietnamese territory, is excluded from the scope of case 002/02, and therefore we would ask for the expert to give, he's asking the expert to give information that's not within the scope of this trial, so I object to the question.
Your Honors, a good part, perhaps the principal part as I understood, of the defense examination of this witness was asking why Vietnam invaded Cambodia. So the commission of atrocities against Vietnamese civilians is extremely relevant to that point, among others.
President, the objection is overruled. The question is very relevant. Therefore, it can be posed to the expert. The question did not ask for the battle in Vietnam.
Let me read the portion of what the expert wrote that I'm asking about. And this is from ERN 010-01765. In your own book, Mr. Morris, Professor Morris, you wrote that on April 30th, 1977, the Khmer Rouge units attacked several villages and towns in An Giang and Chau Doc provinces of southern Vietnam, burning houses and killing hundreds of civilians. So my question is about the targeting of civilians in these attacks inside Vietnam. Did you, from your research, from what you've read of others, did you determine whether or not civilians were specifically targeted by the Khmer Rouge?
I believe that in these attacks, civilians were deliberately targeted by the Khmer Rouge. I'm not aware of military targets in the areas where the attacks took place.
Thank you. In Chanda's book, Brother Enemy, at ERN 001-92272, in Khmer, the ERN is 001-91402, and in French, 00236981 at the bottom of that page. He said that on that night of April 30th, 1977, the Khmer Rouge had attacked a string of villages and townships in An Giang province. He wrote that the killing civilians and burning down houses. He wrote that the attack on Tien Yen Township alone, and of course my pronunciation is, I'm sure, I have no idea how close I am, had caused about 100 civilian deaths. Chanda goes on to write, although the Cambodians had in fact been raiding Vietnam's border provinces since January 1977, their choice of April 30th to launch the most vicious attack to date was rich with symbolism. Can you explain that comment? Do you understand what Chanda's point is, and tell us whether you agree with it?
Yes, April 30th was the anniversary, the second anniversary of the conquest of South Vietnam by North Vietnam, by the Communist Party of Vietnam, and therefore to have staged an attack against Vietnamese villages on April 30th was an attempt to discredit or cast an unpleasant aroma around the anniversary.
Thank you. I understand from my colleague that there may have been the translators may not have understood me and translated the date that Chanda wrote about that attack as being 13 April. In fact, I said 30 April. Thank you. Now, did you ever meet or know this Hungarian journalist, Kandor Dora?
No.
And how did you learn about his own experiences in Vietnam?
His experiences were reported first by Chanda, by Nayan Chanda, and then I found evidence to support it in the Soviet archives.
Thank you. So in your book at the ERN 01001766, you write at the bottom of the page about Chanda Dora's visit to Tay Ninh, where you said he witnessed many ruined buildings and many dead and burned people, mainly women and children. Now, was Kandar Dora, allowed to report on that at that time?
I object to this question because the prosecution seems to suggest that this evidence is about an alleged Cambodian attack on the 30th of April 1977. However, the Hungarian journalist, together with Chanda and a Dutch journalist, Van Wolveren, visited Vietnam in March or February or March 1978. So the two have nothing to do with each other.
In fact, I did not give the dates of that visit, but I can do that. And it begins on this page I quoted, 01001766. He wrote that on September 27th, 1977, Pol Pot openly declared the existence of the CPK. The message was sent after hundreds of Vietnamese civilians had been massacred in Khmer Rouge raids on September 24th. So I think that is important to point out, and I thank Counsel for that. These are actually talking about raids in September 1977. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So these are separate from the raids that we talked about previously in April. Can you tell us, how did Kandar Dura get to observe the aftermaths of those attacks, and what happened about his reporting?
Again, that's incorrect. There were also apparently attacks in February, March 1978. So again, that's a time period of 5 or 6 months. Has nothing to do with each other.
I appreciate that there are so many attacks by the Khmer Rouge into Vietnam that one could be confused, but it appears from the order that you gave this in your book that these are related to the September attacks. But Professor, can you comment on that?
Yes, initially the Hungarian journalist to whom you refer took notes and photographs, and then the Vietnamese asked him not to talk about it. Those photographs and notes were confiscated, and they were given back later when he was allowed to write about it.
In fact, you write on the next page from the one that I mentioned that yet on October 1st, the situation totally changed. The Vietnamese demanded that Dura hand over all his materials. At the end of the paragraph, you say the Hanoi leaders suppressed the evidence until the end of 1977, when the journalists' notes, films, and other materials were returned. So is it clear to you that you were talking about a visit in late September 1977 by this Hungarian journalist? We didn't get your answer because of the mic.
Yes, it seems to me that this was fairly clearly a reference to events that took place in September 1977.
Now, Nayan Chanda writes about his own visit to border areas in March 1978. And this is at English page 00192-405, and to the next page in Khmer, 2 pages beginning 00191-555, and in French again 2 pages 00237-083. Chanda writes about his March visit. In place after place along the border, we saw villages in ruins, abandoned paddy fields, and hundreds of graves. From survivors, we heard unprompted stories of medieval atrocities. There was no longer any doubt in my mind about the reality of this bitter conflict that the Vietnamese had kept out of the public view for so long. So a couple of questions about that. First, can you explain why Vietnam would have wanted to suppress, for at least a time period, the evidence of the Khmer Rouge crossing their borders and committing atrocities against Vietnamese civilians?
I think that they may have thought that this was something that needed to be resolved off the record, off the public record, that they may have believed that this was something which was at the behest of local commanders, and therefore waited to see whether the central authorities in Phnom Penh would rein them in. I believe that the Vietnamese did not want to get involved in a conflict with the Cambodians over these matters at that time, a public conflict, and they would resolve it perhaps quietly and secretly.
What does it say to you about their intention to negotiate or not? The Vietnamese intention.
I think the Vietnamese were intending to negotiate to try and stop these attacks.
Now, you were asked this morning about whether a few selected statements were read to you, whether those selected statements were reasonable. I want to ask you about the actions of the attacks into Vietnam, committing atrocities against civilians. In your opinion, can you tell us, was that reasonable? Yes, now you repeat the question.
Expert, please hold on.
Could you repeat the question, please?
This morning you were read a few selected excerpts of statements by DK leaders and asked if those statements in isolation were reasonable. I'm asking you whether the actions of the DK authorities in these attacks across the border where civilians were specifically targeted were reasonable in your view?
I don't believe that attacks on innocent civilians were reasonable.
Now, you said it might have been, you don't know whether or not this was a local initiative. Have you ever reviewed telegrams from the DK's ambassador in Hanoi to Pol Pot and other leaders about Vietnamese complaints about these attacks?
I don't recall.
Perhaps we may have time to review some of those. There's another person who's written about these attacks, and that is Q Sampan. In document E3, Thank you. In document E3/18 at English 00103759 and on to the next page. In Khmer at 00103849 and to the next page. And in French at 005954446 and to the next page. Q Sampan describes how he claims he only became aware about these attacks after he surrendered in the late 1990s. And specifically talking about the late April 1977 attacks on Tin Bien village of An Giang province. He said from sources after 1979 he learned that, well, he says about attacks on villages in Tay Ninh and Ha Tieng provinces at the end of September. The events recounted are irrefutable. There is no doubt that the Khmer Rouge made forays into Vietnamese villages along the border, committing appalling crimes against Vietnamese civilians. Would you agree with Khieu Samphan that the evidence is irrefutable?
Yes, I agree.
I'd like to ask you about something you wrote on page 98 of your book. The ERN is 01001765. You said that in April 1977, on the occasion of the second anniversary of the liberation of Phnom Penh, the government-controlled media in Hanoi offered congratulations and praise for the DK regime. But this goodwill gesture reaped no beneficial consequences for Vietnam. The Khmer Rouge deliberately chose the second anniversary of the Vietnamese communist conquest of South Vietnam to leave a bloody calling card. And then you talk about those April 30th attacks. Did you come across evidence that the Vietnamese authorities were trying to lower the tension in the conflict, to take the conflict from the battlefield to negotiations?
I think that was true in 1977.
You also wrote on the same page that on September 27th, 77, the Pol Pot openly declared the existence of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. The Central Committee of Vietnam sent a message of congratulations, publicly expressing its joy. He said, interestingly, this message was sent after hundreds of Vietnamese civilians had been massacred in raids on September 24th. Is this further evidence of what you're talking about? Evidence that in 1977, even as late as September 77, the Vietnamese were hoping that the conflict could be de-escalated and negotiated.
Yes, that's my opinion.
There's another document I would like to ask you about, and this is E3/7338. And it's, I guess, this is your book. The ERN is 01001768. And in this particular passage, you're describing a discussion on the 6th of October, 77, between Le Duan and the Soviet ambassador to Hanoi about Vietnam's reaction to the 24 September massacres in Tay Ninh province. You wrote, quote, "After noting the massacres of Vietnamese women and children by the Khmer Rouge, Le Duan noted that the Vietnamese army had the capability to rout the Kampuchean army quickly. And then you go on to say, Vietnam's response, according to Le Duan, was to display patience and attempt to find a peaceful resolution of all questions with Kampuchea. First, would you agree with Le Duan? Was he telling the truth when he said Vietnam had the capability to rout the DK forces quickly if they had wanted to?
Yes, I agree.
Okay, we'll come back a little bit and go into a little bit more depth on the disparity in forces. But again, do you believe Le Duan was still exhibiting here in the 6th of October, 77, a willingness to try to reach a peaceful resolution with Democratic Kampuchea before resorting to force?
Yes, I agree.
On page 102, and that's ERN 01001769, you wrote that on December 31st, 1977, the government of the Democratic Kampuchea announced that it was temporarily
There is no Khmer translation. International co-prosecutor, you may continue.
Thank you. You wrote on this page 102 that on December 31st, 1977, the government of Democratic Kampuchea announced that it was temporarily severing diplomatic relations with the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, pending the withdrawal of the, quote, aggressor forces, unquote, of the SRV from the, quote, sacred territory of Democratic Kampuchea, unquote. It said, you wrote that Khieu Samphan, on behalf of the Cambodian government, read a speech at this time on Vietnamese aggression. Now, putting this in context, the severing of relations at the very last day of the year 1977, something had occurred before that. There was a Vietnamese attack into Cambodia, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And can you tell us a little bit about this attack?
The Vietnamese launched an offensive which led to the capturing of a number of Khmer Rouge soldiers, and they also took with them some civilians into Vietnam.
Do you know whether or not whether any civilians voluntarily went with them as opposed to being forcibly transported out of Democratic Kampuchea to Vietnam?
As I recall, the civilians voluntarily relocated with the Vietnamese to Vietnam.
Let's talk a little bit more depth about this attack. But perhaps to preface it, let us talk about the forces, the relative strengths of the forces between the two countries. On page 103 of your book at ERN 01001770, You wrote that there are certain objective military facts that should have been strongly influencing the decisions of the leaders on both sides. First was the huge disparity in size of the armed forces on each side. In 1977, the armed forces of DK were estimated to total 70,000. The armed forces of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam were estimated to total 615,000. Can you comment on how the various armies, their relative strength in terms of numbers, quality of weapons, quality of experience, and quality of generalship?
Yes, the Vietnamese had a far more battle-hardened and experienced soldiers, commanding officers, as well as equipment, and also an air force. Cambodia had almost no air force. The Vietnamese did have a small air force. Tanks, the Khmer Rouge had only some light tanks. The Vietnamese had a large number of tanks, more modern tanks. The disparity of force was massive in both quality and quantity.
And I'm sure you don't now recall the numbers, so let me read what you wrote on that same page. You said the armed forces of DK constituted a light infantry. It included a few light tanks, some 200 armored personnel carriers, and virtually no air force. By contrast, the armed forces of the SRV included some 900 medium and light tanks and a 12,000-person air force with 300 combat aircraft, including one light bomber squadron and 8 fighter ground attack squadron of 150 aircraft, and a fighter ground squadron, attack squadron of 150 aircraft. At that time, where had Vietnam obtained its weapons?
At that time, most of its weapons would have come from the Soviet Union.
And what?
Some light weaponry may have come from China. But certainly the Air Force and heavy tanks were Soviet.
And what happened to the arms of the South Vietnamese government that had been defeated, which I would imagine were mainly supplied by the United States? Can you comment upon how much quantity and quality of weapons the regime in Hanoi had obtained following their victory in '75?
Yes, the North Vietnamese had obtained a substantial percentage of the weaponry, which I'm sure an overwhelming majority of the weaponry that was in the hands of the South Vietnamese Army in 1975. Although some of these weapons were provided to the Soviet Union so that the Soviet Union could use them to support national liberation movements, as they were so called, in other parts of the world, without being traceable to the Soviet Union. The same thing, by the way, happened after the Korean War. The weapons captured from Allied forces some of them were used to supply the North Vietnamese.
Thank you. Now, in talking about that late '77 offensive, Nyan Chanda writes in Brother Enemy, that's E3/2376, at ERN in Khmer 00191-539, in French 000-237-072, and in English at 00192391. He wrote that the Vietnamese purpose was, as Hoang Tung later explained to me, quote, first to chase them from our territory and then deal a heavy blow to their divisions, to make them realize that we are not passive as they have assumed, and to tell them that they have to choose the other solution, negotiations. The first of the Vietnamese objectives was achieved almost effortlessly. Vietnamese forces, backed by artillery barrages, had gone into Cambodia like a knife through soft butter. Do you agree with Chanda, and can you expand at all upon his view that the results of the battle were one-sided? The Vietnamese easily were able to overcome any DK resistance?
Yes, I agree. It was easy for the Vietnamese to achieve their military objectives in Cambodia at that time, and the Democratic Kampuchea forces were in no position to wage a conventional war against the Vietnamese. Their only option was guerrilla war, which they did not pursue.
And can you tell us who is Hoang Tong and what you make of his statement that the purpose was to chase them out of the territory, make them realize we are not passive, and to tell them they have to choose negotiations?
Please hold on.
I'm sorry, I don't recall Hoang Tong and his status. But yes, look, I think that they were trying to teach them, the Khmer Rouge, a lesson. They were acting in order to pursue a deterrent policy, you might say, against the Khmer Rouge, rather than defeat them completely, make them suffer sufficiently that they would then cease and desist or else negotiate.
Just to remind everyone of what you wrote on page 102, 01001769. You said the decisive military penetration of the Parrot's Beak region of Cambodia by the Vietnamese army was initially halted short of the city of Svay Rang after the Vietnamese had inflicted a major defeat upon their enemies. In early January, the Vietnamese withdrew from Cambodia, taking with them thousands of prisoners as well as civilian refugees. With their forces only 24 miles from Phnom Penh, the Vietnamese could have easily captured the capital city and occupied all of Cambodia. But as they explained to a Bulgarian journalist later, this was impossible for them politically. The purpose of their offensive seems to have been to inflict damage upon and thus temper Khmer Rouge aggression. Does this remain your view?
Yes, this remains my view.
Was the attack successful in getting the DK to alter its behavior and to negotiate with the Vietnamese?
No, it was not.
Did attacks from Cambodia into Vietnam continue?
Yes.
Now, I mentioned earlier some telegrams from the DK ambassador in Hanoi. Were you familiar, sir, with a man named Heng Sok Kieng, that's Kheang, alias Chien, who was the DK ambassador to Hanoi.
No, sir, I'm not familiar with him.
Just for the parties and Your Honor's benefit, there's a record E3/2270. This is an S21 record at English 00784-584, Khmer 000-86738, and French 0081-0094, which indicates that Heng Sok Kieng, alias Chien, ambassador to Hanoi, entered S21 on the 25th of February 1978, and he was executed on the 31st of December 1978. He appears in the OCIJ list as number 12927. Sir, in a 15 June 1977 telegram, this is E3/878, the Khmer ERN is 00001264. The English is 0182770, and there's not a French. It indicates that this was distributed to Pol Pot, Nun Chea, Ieng Sary, Vorn Vet, Sun Sen, and office. It says, quote, on 14 June 1977, starting at 8 p.m., a company of our forces committed aggression across their border over a length of 40 kilometers from Sa Sien to Dum Chit, Ha Tien. I should explain, this is what the ambassador is reporting the Vietnamese are complaining to him about. So he's saying the Vietnamese said, our forces with 105s hauled in as auxiliary support carried out a coordinated storming attack against their security posts, slaughtering and torching residences, bringing about enormous casualties. I'm going to ask you about all of these together. So the next one is E3/880. It's at English 00182766 and the next page. Khmer 001258 and French 00623013. This is a telegram dated the 20th of July 1977. I think the same distribution. And this is reporting on a letter received from Sun. It said, quote, it is said that on 16, 17, 18 July, Cambodian armed forces launched hundreds of mortar 105 millimeter onto the area with crowds of people in the An Giang province. It destroyed mainly people as well as materials. From 16 to 17 July, there were 30 people dead and 50 people injured and a large number of houses burnt. It goes on to say, once again, Vietnam wants to clarify that Vietnam still wants to meet Cambodia to cease the bloodshed and maintain solidarity of both parties. Another telegram, this one dated 4th of August 1977. This is E3/882. Telegram 62 from Chien, distributed to the same persons. And it reports that the Vietnamese complain the Kampuchean army has committed mass killings of 1,000 ordinary Vietnamese people at Ha Tien in Quien Giang province. another telegram dated a few weeks later, 30 August 1977, from Chian to the same parties. The year ran in English 00182-762, in Khmer 0000-1237, and in French 00386257. It's talking about, again, a protest from Sun, saying that since early August, Kampuchean army has invaded such provinces as An Giang, Long An, and Tai Ninh. Kampuchean army has killed and burned down houses, causing great damage to human lives and properties. 10 people were killed, including a woman whose belly had been cut open. And it ends by saying Vietnam would like to confirm that the two parties, as well as governments, must call a meeting for a resolution in order to end the bloodshed. Now, sir, given all of these telegrams to the central authorities, Pol Pot, Nguyen Chea, and the office, did you ever come across any evidence that the DK responded by saying, "Oh, you're being attacked, we're surprised. These must be local commanders, we had no idea"?
No, I have not encountered such evidence.
Would the lack of any such response by the Vietnam DK authorities denying that this was a policy of the center indicate anything to you about whether in fact it was a policy of the center?
Given the
President, Mr. Expert, please hold on. The floor is given to Counsel Aung Takushe.
Oui.
Yes, Mr. President, here I must object to the manner in which the prosecution is posing his questions, aside from the fact that quite a while ago, these facts, they've been talking about something, these facts which are not within the scope of this trial, as I said before. I must also object once again, and that is I see a legal problem on the possibility of the defense to talk about things which are not within the scope of the trial. Also, the way this question was asked, and certainly I'll come back to this when I'm questioning, but this expert has not carried out specific research on the Democratic Kampuchea documents, even in the context of his work with the Soviet archives. So to ask him today to confirm that this was a policy of the center, this comes back to speculation rather than the basis of his own research and the documents he would have himself read on the position of the Democratic Kampuchea people. So I object to this question.
Thank you. One thing I'd like to note, this morning and yesterday afternoon, Counsel for Nguyen Chea asked this witness about these attacks. There was no objection from the Q Sampan defense that this was outside the scope. The crimes are not part of the charges in this case, but clearly it's relevant to issues in this case and the testimony of this expert as to the relationship between Vietnam and DK and why Vietnam eventually invaded Cambodia, both in late 77 and then in late 77 and very late 1978. As to whether this witness can speak to these telegrams, the witness said he did not review DK documents. That's why I read them to him. However, the witness has reviewed Soviet archives of the Vietnamese diplomatic material. And the question I'm asking him, and I asked him, he's already answered, he has not found any response from the from the DK to Vietnam trying to explain, oh, we're very sorry about these attacks, we didn't order them, they're done by local commanders. So the fact that such response does not exist is obviously highly relevant. I'll move on to another question, but
Je voudrais quand
Nevertheless, just for the needs of the record, the prosecutor has just told us that he is reading documents which the expert is not familiar with, and he's asking the expert if he knows if he has any responses to these documents with which the expert is not familiar. That's why I'm stating this objection. If the expert didn't know about these telegrams to begin with, I don't know how he can know of a response to these telegrams.
I think I'll just repeat what I said in the morning when the same issue came up with Nunchia, who presented the expert with lots of documents he had never seen before. I think we can trust this expert to warn the chamber in cases where he feels that he cannot comment on documents or needs more context. He has done that. I'm confident he'll do that again, and he's the best one to actually know what is within his expertise and what is outside, and I'm also sure he will tell us accordingly, inform us accordingly.
so I'm going to move on to a question about events in early 1978. And this comes from E3/1593. The ERN in English is 011-50201, and the next page in Khmer 00637-942, and the next page, and in French at 00639-168, and the next page. This is Ben Kiernan's writing. On 5 February 1978, Hanoi offered Democratic Kampuchea a new proposal. It called for negotiations, a mutual pullback of 5 kilometers on either side of the border, and international supervision of the border to prevent aggression across it. Had Pol Pot's regime accepted this offer, it most likely would have survived. So first let me ask you about this. Are you familiar of a Vietnamese offer as late as February 1978 for negotiations with DK?
No, I'm not familiar with such an offer.
He goes on to write, meanwhile, the center pursued its military incursions over the border. On 14 March, DK troops invaded the Vietnamese province of Ha Tien, slaughtering and disemboweling up to 100 peasants of both Vietnamese and Khmer origin. Looking back over this period several months later, Phnom Penh Radio unwittingly acknowledged Cambodia's aggression. And he quotes the radio station, "In March, the Vietnamese did not have the strength to attack us. Instead, we continued to attack them," unquote. By June 1978, 750,000 Vietnamese had fled their homes near the border, seeking refuge elsewhere in Vietnam. Meanwhile, DK officials had refused to even accept delivery of a copy of the Hanoi 5 February peace proposal. Do you understand from the Phnom Penh radio announcement that in March, Vietnam did not have the strength to attack us? Instead, we continued to attack them. Is that consistent with what you know about the behavior of the DK in early 1978? That they were continuing to attack Vietnam?
Yes, that's consistent with what I know.
Thank you. Is this a
President, thank you. It is now convenient time for the break. The chamber will take a break from now until 3 o'clock. Court officer, please assist the expert at the waiting room during the break time and invite him back to the courtroom at 3 o'clock. The court is now in recess.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រោកឈរ